Last year, we were told that Jaqueline Wilson is gay. Which may not be strictly true. The actual article shows that she's been married to a woman for 20-odd years, was previously married to a man, tends not to really be attracted to anybody as such, and prefers to not really put labels on things. So, nice job on capturing the complexity of that and not reducing or erasing any of it for the sake of a catchy headline. She's not actually specified her sexuality, but from this we can at least gather that she's not straight. And last year she released her first book featuring a queer main character. For those who don't know, Jaqueline Wilson is an English children's author. Hugely prolific, with over 100 books written to date, she's known for her ability to cover complex and difficult topics from a surprisingly relatable young person's perspective, and for her distinctive sense of humour, characterised by illustrations and cover art by Nick Sherratt, which gives her books an instantly recognisable visual style. Her works are incredibly widely read and well loved, with several, most notably the Tracy Beaker series, being made into popular TV adaptations. I never saw these myself, because as far as I was concerned, if it wasn't animated Nick Sherratt, was it really still Jaqueline Wilson? I think not. They even teased us with what they could have done, so I got excited thinking the show would be a cartoon when it wasn't. Look at this misleading intro. Betrayal. Anyway, her books formed an integral part of my childhood and early teen years, as they did for hundreds and thousands of others. In 2002, she became the most borrowed author from British libraries, a position she retained for 6 years before being overtaken by James Patterson in 2008. In 2003, 4 of her books were ranked among the most popular 100 books in the UK. And according to the concerned mums on Mumsnet, children continue to read her books today. Which is really cool. I'd sort of assumed kids just don't read books anymore. In the interview, Jaqueline Wilson is of course asked about the relationship between her sexuality and her work. And while she does have 1 or 2 canonically gay side or background characters and a fair bit of queer coding, a queer main storyline has never appeared in one of her books until last year. Which is honestly a bit strange. After all, she's covered nearly every other teenage problem under the sun. Why wasn't deviant sexuality among them? She has 2 responses. The first is that she normally wrote about characters with problems, and since she didn't see any problem whatsoever with being gay, she couldn't find any plot to draw from it. For the second, she says, I don't think that girls would have wanted a grey-haired, wrinkly writer as a role model if they were wanting to feel good about being gay. I'm sure they could find much more glamorous examples. And, acknowledging the issues that queer people face because of stigmatisation in society is not the same thing as saying queerness itself is the problem, and I think it's kind of disingenuous to present it as such. I mean, can you imagine if somebody was just like, oh, I see no problem with not being white, so I'm not going to include any characters of colour in my works. And even if you buy that she genuinely doesn't think queer people have any problems specifically due to being queer, that still doesn't explain their exclusion. After all, she writes heterosexual characters who don't suffer from being heterosexual just fine. And the whole wouldn't want me as a role model thing is just, I mean, even if she believes it, it's clearly untrue. Young queer people would have benefited from any kind of positive role model at all, especially an author as well-loved and widely well-regarded as Jaqueline Wilson. And again, even if you buy that logic, why would straight girls want her as a role model either? Just stop writing. We don't know whether Jaqueline Wilson always knew that she wasn't straight, or if that's something she only realised later. But even if we assume that she did, it still doesn't make sense that she wouldn't think to write it into a book, given that she covered nearly every other controversial topic there is. Her explanations don't make sense, and I don't buy them. So, what was really going on? The Early Climate and Section 28. Jaqueline Wilson published her first book in 1969, 2 years after homosexuality was decriminalised in the UK, and the same year as the Stonewall riots took place in the US. The law only decriminalised relationships between men and only over the age of 21. Relationships between women had never officially been illegal. Nonetheless, this meant that Jaqueline Wilson grew up at a time where homosexuality was not only frowned upon, but against the law. And growing up in an environment like that is going to subconsciously impact the way you perceive being gay, even if you intellectually believe that it's fine. However, it wasn't just a case of old backwards laws being a hindrance, but new ones that would come into place and specifically limit her as a children's author. Section 28 was a clause put into place that prohibited the promotion of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. The promotion of homosexuality was seen as anything that didn't present it as abnormal. This effectively banned the subject outright from discussion in UK schools. The proposed law was opposed by Labour. It was also widely challenged by the LGBT community and protested in a big way, culminating with 4 lesbians doing what?
3 women gay rights protesters caused pandemonium in the House of Lords when they abseiled from the public gallery onto the floor of the chamber.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. In the House of Lords, a vote is taking place now on a challenge to the poll tax. Tory rebels have said that the tax is unfair and unpopular. And I do apologise if you're hearing quite a lot of noise in this studio at the moment. I'm afraid that we have rather been invaded by some people who we hope to be removing very shortly.
But despite all of this, the law still came into place in 1988, well after homosexuality was decriminalised. And a large part of this was due to backlash to a children's book entitled Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. Originally published in 1981 in Danish and then 2 years later in English, the book, as you can probably imagine, is about a young girl living with her 2 dads. It detailed sordid matters such as having a birthday party and visiting the laundrette. At one point, the characters receive some homophobic insults from a bystander on the street, resulting in a conversation between Jenny and her dads about homophobia, but that's as close as the book gets to discussing anything gay. And homophobic abuse is a very real issue that the children of gay parents will encounter. But this attempt at normalising gay relationships to children resulted in a wave of puritanical moralising across the country, summarised perfectly by Margaret Thatcher in 1987.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated.
In the name of protecting the children, a law was passed that caused unimaginable harm to queer people, in particular queer children. Queer teachers were forced to hide their identities, and any adults working with children who came across a queer child were not allowed to tell that child that it was okay for them to be queer. There was zero mention of homosexuality in the curriculum, no reading material available in libraries, and no support system available for young queer people who desperately needed it. Queer children grew up during this time in the absence of anything that didn't present them as dangerous or diseased. It's unsurprising that many queer adults chose not to speak about their identities during this time. It's unsurprising that Jaqueline Wilson thought that the best way to say queerness wasn't a problem was never to mention it. Because if the world sees you as inherently bad, then your best hope is to keep your head down, live a quiet life, and hope at least to be tolerated. If that's where the general consensus is, then there's no space to say, actually, this is good and fine, and especially not to children. The law was passed in response to someone doing exactly that. In 2003, Section 28 was repealed. But it would be another 17 years before Jaqueline Wilson wrote a book starring a gay main character. The Aftermath. By the time the ban had been lifted, the damage was already done. The scene was set and queer representation had been thoroughly eradicated from children's media. I remember teachers being cagey about their sexuality just a few years after the ban lifted, often kind of hinting at being queer but dodging direct questions about it. And that was while I was in school. But just a few years ago, a friend who works in a children's home was called to the head office for answering the question, "Are you gay?" coming from one of the kids, with a direct and unapologetic yes. The justification is always something along the lines of, well, why would you discuss your sexuality with children? As if men casually referencing their wife in a classroom or women changing their entire honorific from Miss to Mrs. because of a formalized sexual relationship tells the children nothing about their sexuality. The truth is that queer sexuality is still seen as inherently sexual, adult, and inappropriate, whereas heterosexuality is seen as so standard that many adults will go, "Is that your girlfriend?" if they see a 2-year-old they've decided is a boy playing with a 2-year-old they've decided is a girl. Very healthy and normal. Straightness is considered so harmless, so expected, so vanilla, that it will be projected onto people who are too young to have any kind of sexuality at all. The perceived inherent sexuality of queerness persists to this day, and the discussion regarding whether or not this material is appropriate for children, even when it is no more explicit than its heterosexual counterparts, continues to hold back queer creatives and harm young queer people in need of positive representation. Steven Universe, well known for blazing a trail for queer relationships in children's cartoons, wasn't supposed to have any queerness in it. Rebecca Sugar only managed this by basically sneaking queer stuff into the story before the higher-ups could object. They told us point blank, you can't have these characters be in a romantic relationship. But at that point, audiences could instantly understand what the relationship was. The song had already been written, the episode had already been boarded, so we were already in full production. I was told I couldn't discuss it publicly. I would privately do drawings of these characters kissing and hugging that I was not allowed to share. I couldn't reconcile how simple this felt to me and how impossible it was to do, so I talked about it. The show survived in a large part because of the support from fans. It seems absurd to think that only a few years ago, and really now, that a person's job, their ability to make cartoons, could hinge on their sexual orientation. It's profoundly unfair and ridiculous, but true. That really needs to shift, and is still in the process of shifting. The argument for queer media sexualizing children is still thrown around. When it came to the She-Ra reboot, this argument was even used by people explicitly upset by the fact that the characters had less classically feminine designs, i.e. sexually appealing to heterosexual men. Going back to my earlier story about the guy who was called into the office for answering the question, "Are you gay?" honestly? Well, it turned out that half of the staff were queer. It's just that they had always refused to answer the question, even though there was no law against it. It had just never occurred to them to do so. It had always just seemed like a bad idea. Through decades of vilification and erasure, growing up with our identities treated as inherently sexual and inappropriate, queer people have come to internalize the idea that we are somehow dangerous or even predatory. Our queerness must be chained up and locked away lest it breaks out and corrupts the youth. The battle isn't just waged against discriminatory legislation or unfair attitudes in society, but against the ideas that we subconsciously hold and enforce about ourselves, even if we intellectually know them not to be true. This kind of internalized queerphobia would undeniably have been a factor in Jaqueline Wilson choosing not to feature gay stories in her children's books, even after it became legally plausible for her to do so. And this isn't really about her specifically. Internalized queerphobia affects all of us, including kids of today, let alone adults who've lived through the literal criminalization of homosexuality. And this kind of damage begins with the compulsory heterosexuality and cis-normativity enforced upon us through our childhood environments. Plenty of queer creatives are desperately trying to catch up with those lost years, to repair the damage and to give queer kids the representation and recognition and support that they need so they don't have to suffer like generations before. But, once again, a moral panic is being stirred up in response. The current climate. As late as 2019, 2 years ago, being transgender was declassified as a mental illness. But just 1 year later, the Bell v Tavistock case placed further restrictions on children's access to hormone blockers in the UK. This month, the UK government's Women and Equalities Committee held a hearing regarding the right to self-ID as trans, where 4 anti-trans hate groups were asked to provide evidence, and no one else. The problems are increasing worldwide. Arkansas has just flat-out banned all treatment for trans children, resulting in a series of teenage suicide attempts and families fleeing the state so that their children can be treated elsewhere. In Florida, a bill was just passed requiring transgender children to play sports as the sex they were assigned at birth, which, if disputed, must be proven, seemingly meaning via genital inspection. 14 more states are currently considering similar anti-trans proposals. Keeping them from passing is a constant battle. Progress is not linear. More often than not, it's one step forward, one step back. Much as Section 28 came into place in response to the increasing acceptance and visibility of gay people, new laws will and are coming into place in response to the increasing visibility and acceptance of trans people. And once again, an entirely fictional threat to children is evoked to frighten the general public into supporting laws that will hurt the children. The disinformation spread by TERFs and transphobes affects people who may otherwise have had no particular feelings on trans people at all. And this loops right back round to Jaqueline Wilson herself, who recently spouted much of the same uninformed nonsense. Where I would be very, very worried is young children taking any kinds of drugs, hormones, or whatever, the long-term effects of which we just don't know. And the whole idea of having major surgery, if you're a young child, it's not just a question of having bits of you lopped off. It's a really serious, difficult surgery which can have pretty devastating consequences, I would imagine. Putting it politely, this is garbage. I'm not gonna go into tons of detail on why, because I've already done that in my video in response to the other transphobia spewing children's author. But in short, kids do not get surgery. They get hormones if they're very, very lucky. And now, thanks to the Bell v. Tavistock ruling, they're gonna struggle even more to access those, which do nothing except give them the time to think that Jaqueline Wilson seems to understand that they need. What she said isn't just a bit wrong, it's the polar opposite of what's actually happening. The situation is constantly presented as if children are being rushed into surgery, when the reality is that they're not even offered hormones until they're 16 years old minimum, and that the waiting time to get their first appointment for that is often several years long. I don't necessarily think that this is enough evidence to say that Jaqueline Wilson is a transphobe noun, certainly not in the same way as the other one, but she is of a generation that has a slight tendency to see a scary sounding headline, form an opinion without doing any further research, and then spew that half-baked waffle to more people who will go on to do exactly the same thing. And this is very dangerous. People are believing and spreading lies, and those lies are informing legislation. Final thoughts. In the UK, a policing bill is currently making its way through the rounds of legislation. It contains a number of fairly uncontroversial proposals, along with some that are verging on downright fascist, including handing the police more power to shut down protests for things like being too noisy, and to criminalise the lifestyles of the already marginalised GRT community. And when I speak to people about this, a lot of people, even left-leaning people, have a tendency to say, oh, I don't think that will happen. That would never happen. That would be authoritarian. Well, you know what else is authoritarian? Effectively indoctrinating kids into heterosexuality by denying them exposure to anything else. Forcing children to undergo physical changes that they don't consent to by making it difficult or impossible for them to access hormone blockers that give them more time to think. Despite vehement opposition, authoritarian laws have been and are being passed. Human rights are not inalienable, as Margaret Thatcher said. They can be and are being taken away. The fact that this policing bill is even being considered should be a reason to actively fight against it. I don't mean to scare people with this video or end it on a downer. God knows we already have enough to be scared of, and most of my viewers are probably super aware of a lot of this stuff already. And I do want to stress the importance of taking care of yourself as much as possible and not burning out through resistance. But we really can't afford to get complacent. It shouldn't have taken this long before Jaqueline Wilson felt able to write a book about a gay character, and we can't afford for similar laws to come into place and cause the same kind of damage to young queer people of today. trans people do tend to really be quite aware of the severity of our situation, so more than anything else, this is really a plea to cis people to see the parallels and to support us and to take our concerns seriously. And above all, to listen to actual trans people and not random children's authors who don't know what they're talking about. Special thanks to my monthly coffee supporters, whose names will be coming up on screen nowish. If you would like to help me make more videos, you can help me out the most by becoming a monthly coffee supporter yourself. If that's not viable for you, which is totally fine, you can also help me a lot by liking this video, sharing it, commenting, and subscribing to my channel. I think I picked up more energy while doing that video, but in case you couldn't tell, I was like half dead at the start. It's probably not visible most of the time because like my disability is quite sort of not super visible. I might talk about it in future, but I'm in a lot of pain. I think I need to like shift my direction a little bit when it comes to videos, because this one, it started off with kind of a fun idea, like, oh, I'm gonna like research Section 28 and stuff, and that's gonna be kind of interesting, and it was, but then I got to the part where I had to like relay it back to today, and I couldn't do it anymore. I think just the intensity of engaging with the discourse right now can just sometimes be too much, and it's not like there's no value in making videos that are more on sort of the entertainment side rather than the educational side, so I might be doing more of that. I do read books, and this video was sort of tangentially about books. Should I talk about books? I could do that. I could talk about books. Does anyone want to hear about books? Does anyone read? Let me know if you have any ideas for topics that might be slightly lighter or anything else you would like me to see me doing, because I do need to think about my health a little bit, and I think if I keep making videos like this I will just burn out. So yeah, thank you for watching as ever, and I'm going to link some resources in the description for ways that you can help.